Welcome, everyone. It's great to see you here. Fourth day of the conference. Everybody holding up okay? My name is Aaron Conley, and I'm the Vice Chancellor for Advancement here at the University of Colorado. I've occupied this role for all of about 6 months, so this is my first conference on world affairs, but I learned within the first few weeks on the job just how important this tradition is in the life of our university. My role includes oversight of all of our alumni programs and outreach, including the CU Alumni Association, and it was during homecoming last fall when I attended the 50th reunion of the class of 1964 that I first learned of this conference. And these alumni reminisced about the things that you would expect: football games, Greek life, the sink, with just as much fondness and reverence as the global leaders that they not only heard speak at this conference, but had the opportunity to meet and get to know. So to me, it's so important for this university to sustain the memories and traditions of our previous generations of alumni, and I'm so pleased to know as I come into this role that the Conference on World Affairs, now in its 67th year, is one of those vital links that keeps us connected to so many of our past graduates. And it's within that spirit that I'd like to briefly thank our current leadership for sustaining this wonderful and vibrant tradition. I want to thank Jane Butcher for her longtime support and dedication. Thanks to John Griffin for engaging these speakers in new ways to personally connect with even more of our students. Thanks to the army of volunteers who this tradition would not be possible without them. I want to thank the donors whose financial support certainly helps us provide this one-of-a-kind experience. And thanks to everyone else who turns out year after year to show just how valuable this event is for the entire Boulder community. And since I think I've just acknowledged everybody in the room, why don't you all give yourselves a round of applause for helping make this happen. So like those alumni from the class of 1964 that I met, I know that I'm not going to forget my experience here today introducing our speaker, Michael Elliott, the president and CEO of One. Now, I hadn't met Michael before today, but I'm very familiar with One because of Bono, the lead singer of U2, and the catalyst behind this organization. And just as an aside, for the last few days, my staff have been asking me, since they knew that I was going to be introducing our speaker, is Bono here? Is he going to make a surprise appearance? Somebody just asked me before I came in, and you know, the first dozen times it was funny, but frankly, it's just getting old. So let me just say one final and definitive time, no, Bono is not here. If you want to see him in Colorado, do what I've done, buy your ticket to their concert when U2 comes to Denver in June to play at the Pepsi Center. So in all seriousness, I will say that Bono is one of the few global figures who has really leveraged the power of their image and celebrity and effectively directed it toward a truly ambitious global goal of overcoming extreme poverty and preventable disease. And as its president and CEO since 2001, Michael Elliott leads this nonpartisan advocacy organization to raise public awareness and work with global political leaders to achieve this goal of ending extreme poverty and preventable disease. Please join me in giving a big Colorado welcome to our speaker, Michael Elliott.
Well, thank you very much, Vice Chancellor, and you all need to kind of congratulate yourself because you all managed to find your way into the plenary that doesn't exist, the plenary that isn't on the printed program, which is entirely my fault, I should say, because I was kind of late in committing to coming back to CWA. It's a rare pleasure to be back here. I've been coming to the conference. Oh, Bono, do you want to come out? Oh, sorry. I've been coming to the Conference on World Affairs off and on for very nearly 30 years now. I think I first came in 1987. I had one of your wonderful student drivers pick me up at the airport yesterday, and we drove from the airport into Boulder. She couldn't take the toll road. She said, no, we're not allowed to take the toll road. So we did 25 and 70, and I said to her, you know, when I first came here, when you left Denver and you got to Boulder, you went through open country. I'm telling you, you know, you remember that? You remember that? Anyway, it's fantastic to be back after, I think, 4 years away. I'm never kind of quite, I'm kind of getting the sort of age where I can never kind of quite remember. But I think I was last here in 2011. And of course, the Conference on World Affairs has a very special place in my heart. I go to speak at conferences all over the world, everywhere from Davos to China to Russia. And what you've built here over the years with this deep involvement of the community and the university is really special. So it's great to be back. The last time I was here, I was still wearing my hat as a journalist. I was the editor of Time International, which I'd been for many years, and I didn't actually start my career as a journalist, but I'd been in the media for nearly 30 years, but since then, as you've just heard, I've switched, and I've been running the One campaign, which is a global advocacy organization committed to eliminating extreme poverty and unpreventable disease, and as you just heard, co-founded by and inspired by Bono. So what I want to talk to you about today is what I call the Age of Miracles. Which is a frame, as I hope you'll see, which sort of informs a lot of the work that we do. So let me start off by telling you how I spent a few days at the end of last summer. Actually over the Labor Day weekend, just before and just after the Labor Day weekend. I live in Washington, D.C., but I'd flown to Europe for a committee meeting of a group that I'm on, where I had colleagues who work on humanitarian relief tell heartbreaking stories of suffering in the refugee camps and in the rubble cityscapes of the Middle East. I flew back from Geneva to the US for Labor Day, and I was away for the weekend at a sort of old-fashioned country house weekend with people who really know what's going on in the world. Ukraine was in the headlines. And over the weekend, I was at a dinner at which well-informed conversation turned for the first time in my life, and I'm 63, on the real possibility of a general war breaking out in Europe. Back in Washington at work after the holiday, I read reports of the brutal execution by ISIS thugs of the American journalist Stephen Sotloff, and then I was briefed on the terrifying spread of Ebola in West Africa, and on the pitifully inadequate initial international response. And then one night, kind of trying to escape the despond in which the news had plunged me, I was browsing Facebook, as you do, and I came across a post by an old friend and colleague of mine, Eric Press, who was for many years the editor of American Lawyer. He was writing from Dakar, Senegal, where he and his wife, they're New Yorkers, were visiting their daughter and their new grandson. He described his thrill at being able to Skype his second daughter back home in New York from thousands of miles away, to click on an app and listen to his beloved Cleveland Indians, even if they lost, and to wake up to a banquet of content, as he put it, from The Economist to NPR to Haaretz and all points in between. Completely ordinary now, I know, Eric wrote in his post. And yet, he continued, he felt like he was living in an age of miracles. And so do I. My parents essentially lived their lives within a few kilometers of where they were born, literally. My father taught for some 40 years at a school, a short drive, 5-minute drive, from his own parents' home. They never flew in their whole lives. My daughters, by contrast, who are in their mid-20s now, had each flown more than 30,000 miles before they were 2, and have lived so far in a combined total of 7 cities on 4 continents. Just like Eric and his passion for the Cleveland Indians, I can follow every football match that Liverpool play, even if occasionally that's a painful experience. When I first lived in the United States 40 years ago, in 1974, I didn't know the scores of a Liverpool game until a copy of the Saturday Night Liverpool Echo, lovingly mailed by my father, arrived in Chicago 4 or 5 days later. And like many others who have been handed a diagnosis of cancer, and I'm sure there are plenty of you in this room who've had cancer in the past, I owe my life to therapies and treatments unimaginable to previous generations. All of this seems to me quite miraculous. Now, Eric and I, to be sure, are lucky. We are, if you like, the patina on a sliver chipped off a great chunk of wood, members of the fortunate few for whom advanced medical care, instant communications, and world-shrinking transport are the norm rather than the exception. And so are you, incidentally. But here's the point that I want you to take away from today. The most dramatic improvements in human health and prosperity have not been limited to people like Eric or me or you. They've been distributed among those who not long ago were thought doomed, as their ancestors had been for countless generations, to short lives of penury and disease. This central truth of our times is still barely understood. Partly, I think, because so few in the global West fully understand what has been going on to their east. I've been lucky enough in my life to spend some time living in Asia and traveling and working there a lot over the last 20 years or so. And it has profoundly altered my view of how the world is. As I often like saying to people, the world looks a hell of a lot better if you're sitting on the Pacific Ocean looking west than if you're looking on the Atlantic Ocean looking east. Much of the dramatic drop in worldwide extreme poverty over recent years, from over a third of the globe's population in 1990 to just over 14% in 2011, has been fueled by Asia's economic growth. And that translates to more than just an improvement in wealth and health. Hundreds of millions of people now have options undreamed of by their parents and grandparents. There are literally hundreds of millions of people in Asia who have in their lifetime gone through having to work 7 days a week, to having to work 6 days a week, to having to work 5 days a week, to being able to take a couple of weekends off, to being able to take some holidays, and then to go and kind of visit the kids in Australia for 2 weeks. I mean, that is an astonishing change in the way in which people's lives are put together. The vast human potential of an entire region has been unlocked. As a Chinese friend, a sort of mentee of mine, said to me not long ago, a young woman in China who actually spent a lot of her born in China, spent a lot of her formative years in the US, is now back living in Beijing. She said to me, "You have to understand, this is the best time to be a Chinese woman, ever. And since Chinese women make up nearly 10% of humanity, that is not a claim of small import." But the modern world's miracles are not just Asian ones. Spend a few hours in the mad bustle of somewhere like Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, for example, and you know that something big is happening. Ethiopia, a society of more than 100 million people, like a number of African nations, now has rates of growth once thought to be exclusively Asian. Since 2000, worldwide malaria mortality rates, malaria, the kind of great killer in tropical climes, have decreased by 47%. That's nearly a half of a 50% reduction in 15 years. Or take AIDS. I always, whenever I kind of talk about HIV/AIDS, I always kind of look around at however many people are in the room and say, okay, so let's think that it's 15 years ago, and let's say that every one of you in this room was an expert on HIV/AIDS. It's 2000. And I said to you, so what do you think the next 15 years are gonna hold for us? And to a man or woman, you would all have said, it's going to be a disaster. It's an unstoppable pandemic. It's going to wipe out whole swathes of the middle class in Africa. There's probably a kind of hidden burden of disease in India and China. It's going to be awful. And here's what's happened. In 2003, in sub-Saharan Africa, just 50,000 people in 2003 were on life-saving antiretroviral drugs to combat HIV/AIDS. Now more than 9 million are. That's 9 million lives saved just by that kind of single one intervention. We can legitimately say in 2015 that we can see the beginning of the end of AIDS. That is an astonishing claim to be able to make, and yet we can make it. And the same is true in education. In 2012, there were 57 million more children in sub-Saharan Africa in primary school than there had been in 2000. Most dramatically of all, what Bill Gates says, the most beautiful child, what Bill Gates calls the most beautiful child in the world. The chance of children making it past infancy is better than it has ever been. In the 1970s, less than 5% of the world's infants received basic life-saving vaccines of the sort that your kids just have as a matter of course. Now more than 80% do. Partly as a consequence, deaths of children under 5 have been cut in half since 1990, from 12.7 million a year then to 6.3 million a year in 2013. And over the next 15 years, we can easily cut it in half again. And since statistics are important but bloodless things, and I often kind of deal in data and figures, I mean, just think of the sheer quantity of funerals avoided, of coffin carpenters put out of business, of grief averted, and of parents who don't have to bury children that those figures represent. That's 6 million fewer children under 5 dead in 2013 than in 1990. And the good news doesn't stop with poverty alleviation and with health. After the horrors that we've all seen in places like Kenya in the last week, it's hard to believe that we live in a time of peace. Yet Harvard's Steven Pinker, in his monumental 2011 book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, has documented the collapse, and there really is no other word, in violence in modern times. There were about 110 homicides for every 100,000 people in 14th century Oxford, less than 1 per 100,000 in 20th century London. Pinker argues that the global reduction in violence has been so great that we may be living in the most peaceable era in our species' existence. And yes, just like Eric and me, millions more can now instantly follow the fortunes of their own versions of the Cleveland Indians or Liverpool Football Club from anywhere in the world. Sometimes, for sure, that development can be lopsided. There are now more cell phones than toilets in India, which is not exactly a kind of a ringing endorsement of India's development priorities. Yet when I asked an expert recently whether we were overhyping the potential of the rapid growth of mobile telecommunications in Africa, where cell phone penetration has risen from 3% in 2002 to more than 70% now, 13 years, 3%, 70%, he briskly told me that it had been underhyped. The explosion of mobile banking in East Africa, for example, means that female, women, smallholder farmers, who are the key to prosperity in so much of Africa, can send and receive payments with complete security, while old-fashioned ballot stuffing has become a lot harder, as we just learned in the Nigerian election, when every poll watcher has a camera on his or her phone and can download, upload what they see in an instant to me or to any journalist anywhere in the world. Yet if there's one thing we know, it's the progress it is that progress is not inevitable. There's a famous passage in John Maynard Keynes' Economic Consequences of the Peace, written in 1919, in which the great economist imagines a Londoner in 1914. And I've put this passage in books that I've written, and I kind of trot it out for speeches all over the world in the last 25 years. Some of you have probably heard me say it again, but here it goes. This is what Keynes said in 1919. The inhabitant of London could order by telephone, sipping his morning tea in bed, the various products of the whole earth in such quantity as he might see fit, and reasonably expect their early delivery upon his doorstep. He could at the same moment and by the same means adventure his wealth in the natural resources and new enterprises of any quarter of the world, and share without exertion or even trouble in their prospective fruits and advantages. He could decide to couple the security of his fortunes with the good faith of the townspeople of any municipality in any continent that fancy or information might recommend. But most important of all, he regarded this state of affairs as normal, certain, and permanent, except in the direction of further improvement, and any deviation from it as aberrant, scandalous, and avoidable. So that's how Keynes thought a Londoner in 1914, I said 1919, I meant 1914, might view the world. He regarded this state of affairs as normal, certain, and permanent, except in the direction of further improvement, and any deviation from it as aberrant, scandalous, and avoidable. And we know how that turned out. So the risks are plain. By comparison to the slaughter that came before it, we have had nearly 7 decades of a long peace since the end of World War II, no matter how violent some years have seemed. But there's no guarantee that this will last forever. Nations could rediscover their taste for combat, which would mean not just needless death, but a revival of global poverty. War zones are poor zones. Economic growth, the engine of many of these miracles, might run out of steam and fail to deliver sufficient well-paying jobs to lift nations out of poverty. With growth slowing in China, there are genuine risks of a contraction in global demand for the commodities that are the foundation of many developing world economies. The wonders of transportation that have enriched the lives of so many might spread pandemic disease around the world. Climate change will be felt first and worst by the poorest, and so on. So how can those dangers be diffused? How can we keep the Age of Miracles going? Well, this year we have a chance to find the answer. This September, at the UN in New York, the nations of the world are set to agree a new set of goals to replace the Millennium Development Goals, which were adopted in 2000. The MDGs, as those in my business call them, committed countries to meeting targets for the reduction of poverty, hunger, and disease. And to be sure, progress on some key goals, like a reduction in maternal mortality, has been disappointing. But it remains the case that 15 years after we adopted the MDGs, the world is on track to cut extreme poverty by more than half. Over the next few months, we'll be negotiating a new sustainable development agenda with goals that are designed to finish the job, to end extreme poverty, bring succor to those who go to sleep hungry each night, and carry the benefits of modern medicine to those who are still denied them. The new goals will have a broader remit than their predecessors. They'll cover not just the basics of human survival, but matters such as clean government and access to justice, and indeed climate change, which of course will have its own conference in Paris later in the year. And they amount to perhaps the most significant set of international agreements since the end of World War II, which saw the birth of the UN, the founding of the Bretton Woods institutions, and the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I know you haven't heard of them because they haven't been in the press, but they will be. Ambition on its own won't provide a better life for the kids that I met at a school in Ghana not long ago. They were thrilled that their village had just gotten its first proper toilets, yet their classrooms were still desperately short of books and other supplies. Words don't change the world, we know, not even, okay, especially, when they are the product of a tortuous drafting process carried out in the conference rooms of international organizations. Goals that are as broad as those now being contemplated risk being so fuzzy that they encourage nothing but a cynical shrug of the shoulders. Yet for all that, setting goals for the world to reduce poverty, to reduce hunger, to reduce infectious disease and other forms of misery is really important. Bill Gates, who doesn't throw compliments around like confetti, once called the Millennium Development Goals the best idea for focusing the world on fighting global poverty that I've ever seen. It certainly wasn't because of their pellucid prose, you can trust me on that. It was, as Gates said, because they allowed people to see where things are going and where we're falling short. New goals will matter not just because of what they say, but because they will give citizens, that's you, a yardstick against which to measure their own nation's performance. They provide a map to our better future, which is great so long as we use it. Because here's the truth. Many of the miracles that have saved so many lives over the past 2 decades aren't supernatural at all. They're quite tangible in an everyday sort of way, as anyone who has helped spread an insecticide-treated betnet at an African hut will gladly tell you. What is truly miraculous is that millions of people, just like you, have put pressure on their governments, north and south, in the rich world and the poor one, to fund and implement the policies that have saved and improved the lives of millions. If the new Sustainable Development Goals are to do their job, then many more millions of global citizens committed to holding their governments to account will have to step up. It isn't government leaders or the wizards of technology or the titans of business who hold the world in their hands. It's rather those countless individuals who are determined that life can be better for themselves and their families, or people just like you in Boulder and 100 other, 1,000 other, 10,000 other towns and villages and cities in the rich world who are moved by compassion for others and a determination to do something about avoidable suffering. To amplify These voices, more than 1,000 organizations now, have banded together in an international coalition called Action 15 that we in One are proud to be part of, that has started the long march towards New York in September. The journey starts next week with the spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank in Washington, D.C., and then it moves to Munich in Germany for the G7 summit, then to Addis Ababa in Ethiopia for a summit on financing development, before it goes to New York and Paris for decisions at the end of the year. There'll be tons of festivals and marches and other celebrations between now and the fall that you and others like you can take part in, so that it becomes clear to politicians that we are watching them to see that they keep the promises to the poorer people of the world that they have made. And celebrations is how we should see these events that we're going to have. Celebrations of an amazing period in which life has gotten safer and healthier for hundreds of millions of people. Continued progress is not assured. The memory of those few anxious days I spent at the end of last summer is all I need to remind me of that. But this year we can do something remarkable. We can adopt a set of development goals for the world that aim to build a better planet and create the global movement that ensures that they are implemented. Do that, and we can make what was once miraculous commonplace. And what a great testament to our shared sense of humanity that would be. Thank you very much.
We have time for questions, so if you have a question, we have microphones on this side and this side, and I will moderate. So if we have one over here, so we'll start on this side.
Thanks, Michael. I think my last conference was when you were here back in 2011 as well. I was looking for your bio in the mag, but couldn't find it because I guess you're a last minute pencil in. But as I recall, you're quite the economist from past conferences, and I was just kind of wondering on a kind of a macroeconomic scale what you might think as far as, like, for instance, commercial banking and whatnot. It's usually not in the interest of commercial banking and global development to really kind of help the poor by and large. You see companies like Goldman Sachs, my uncle retired there from, and he was a big fan of The Economist magazine, which I'm sure you're familiar with as well. And so anyways, I was just kind of wondering from a macroeconomic perspective what you might kind of think in that regard. And the last little comment or question is, as far as Bono, is he making a full recovery, or how does that stand? Thank you.
Economic growth is the greatest. If there's one thing that takes more people out of poverty than anything else, it's economic growth. That we know from the experience in Asia, from Southeast Asia, from China, from India now. That economic growth is the best thing that you can possibly do to get people out of poverty. What's really, really important, though, what's really, really, really important is inclusive economic growth. Is economic growth that is shared broadly across a society. There are nations in Africa now that are growing at 7-8% a year, but have levels of inequality that are ridiculously high, where the kind of fruits of economic growth are not being spread, where they're being appropriated by an elite, being not spent on health and education and all the services that can actually improve people's lives, but being spirited out of the country to tax havens under a palm tree here or a skyscraper there. So I'm a huge believer in economic growth. I worked for The Economist magazine for a long, long time, and I'm a growth guy. But what's clear is that the growth that we need to see to really have an impact on reducing poverty is growth whose benefits are widely spread, which is inclusive, and whose benefits go into that essential social infrastructure of improving health, improving education, reducing gender differences, making lives significantly better for women and girls, and all the things that we now know we need to do.
Other questions? As the moderator, I'm going to exercise my right and ask a question.
Ask away.
So the other part of my role here at the University of Colorado is overseeing all of our fundraising operations. And in preparation for your presentation today, I was doing a little more research on one and was mistaken in thinking that donors can make a gift to one, and then one goes along and invests that in different parts of the world, but that's not exactly the case.
No.
How do donations that come into your organization help advance?
We don't actually ask people for money at all. We always say to, you're more than happy to join one and be a supporter of one. I'd love everyone in this room just to kind of, go on your mobile, go to one.org and join up. But we always say to people, we're not asking for your money, we're asking for your voice. We're funded by a variety of foundations and philanthropists around the world. And our job is as an advocacy organization. What Bono and others' genius was to recognize that in the poverty and preventable disease field, what was really needed was an organization that was going to advocate for intervention, solutions, and funding that would really tackle the issues and problems of our time. The extraordinary figures that I gave you on HIV/AIDS, for example, a minute ago, so that's sort of a great example. Who did that? Who has rolled back AIDS? Well, lots and lots of people have rolled back AIDS. Phenomenally brave, committed, and passionate activists in the 1980s, who actually have made life better than all of us. I mean, for any of us who've gone through a patient experience and have seen the way in which hospitals now have to treat us compared with the way they treated us 25 years ago. Doff a chapeau to the guys at ACT UP and everyone in the LGBT community who kind of really fought for AIDS in the 1980s, because we owe them a huge debt. So brave activists, brilliant scientists, wonderful doctors, politicians who realized that this was a good thing to do, like, who's the politician who did more than anyone else to fight international AIDS in the world? You all know the answer to this, I'm sure. George W. Bush, a true hero in Africa for all that he did on AIDS. But what really counted was government writing checks with 8 figures in them. What really counted was government writing checks with 8 figures of them. American taxpayers, between 2003, when Bush introduced PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan to fund AIDS relief, in the 2003 State of the Union, between then and now, US taxpayers have spent $55 billion. That's real money. That's real money on fighting HIV/AIDS internationally. So the place for an organization like us is to be a constant advocate for government funding, not just in the US, incidentally, all around the world, because we have offices everywhere. Not everywhere, but we have offices in anywhere where there's a check to be got. I always like to kind of say, everyone needs an NRA, and I'm the NRA for the poor, sick people of the world, okay? So what we do is go out and advocate and lobby and campaign for those resources, north and south, and increasingly south as well as north, to flow into rolling back poverty, rolling back preventable disease, rolling back hunger and malnutrition, and making people's lives better. Yes?
Yeah, we'll go over here and then we'll come back.
Hi, thank you for your very uplifting remarks. I'd like to ask, again, in your capacity as an economist, you talk about the importance of income equality, that inclusiveness is really a big driver. But of course, underlying economic growth has to be there. And we've had this period of gangbusters growth for years, driven largely by the emerging world. And now all of a sudden we have a slowdown in the developed world, a significant slowdown in China. Maybe India is a bright hope, it's hard to say. Are you concerned that there's been this incredible trajectory that now with a leveling or even a deceleration of growth is going to disappear?
I absolutely am. I mean, I'm very concerned by it at all. I mean, I lived in Hong Kong for a few years. I've traveled very widely in China. And you can sort of watch economic growth in China. I mean, you can kind of, over a day, you can just kind of sit and watch it. There it happens in front of you. Another crane goes up or what have you. I mean, it's almost a physical thing. And we know that a lot of the extraordinary economic growth in the last 15 years has indeed been fueled by the phenomenal development of China and other parts of East Asia too, and now increasingly India. The reason that the slowdown in China is so important is because many of the poorest countries of the world have economies that are incredibly dependent on commodities. So I'm telling you what you obviously know because you're nodding your head. But to the rest of you, many of the poorest countries of the world have economies which are over-dependent on commodities. And so when you get a slowdown in the phenomenal pace of infrastructure development in China and the rest of Southeast Asia, that hits demand for iron ore, for manganese, for all sorts of commodities which are often produced in the poorest parts of the world. Now this, of course, is a double-edged sword because it is troublesome that the demand for raw materials and commodities might go into reverse with a slowing down in the rate of growth of China and other massive emerging markets. On the other hand, it is also true that no economy should be dependent on commodities the whole time, because if you're dependent on commodities, you slip into what economists call the resource curse, where you overinvest in a sector of the economy, extractive resources, which doesn't actually employ many people, and whose gains can quite easily be appropriated by an elite, siphoned out of the country to a palm tree or a skyscraper, and just kind of fuel a life of Ferraris and Picassos. So it's a balance. On the one hand, it is quite worrying that there is a slowdown in the kind of really big emerging economies of the world, because that hits demand for commodities, and that hits poor countries. On the other hand, poor countries over time need to diversify their economies away from an over-reliance on commodities, because with a few very rare exceptions, most of them Norwegian, no one has been able to build a sustained society with benefits distributed equitably simply on the back of commodities. I suppose Norwegian and Colorado, I should say. Because you guys, of course, done it brilliantly. Sorry, just did a little eye roll, you know, there. Gentlemen, there's had one question.
Yeah,
are there any others?
We do have time for one more question, so if you've got another one, go right
I
ahead.
just had a quick follow-up regarding global warming, how global warming is stressing the economies all around the world, obviously, and, you know, with the droughts and whatnot, and that's obviously causing poverty and increasing disease and so on and so forth. And so from your perspective and our banker's perspective, how might central banking kind of pull into that? I know, you know, Europe is obviously hurting pretty seriously, and you know, China is no real moratorium on the new factories that they're building, adding to global warming. So how it just kind of goes kind of full circle. How might we? Because I know it's economic development, but then we're kind of fouling our own nest at the same time. So thank you.
So, you know, one of the things that we have to sort out this year is that we have two international summits towards the end of the year. We have a development summit in New York in September, and then we have a climate summit in Paris at the beginning of December. And we need to make sure that we get the alignment between those two summits right. That we need to get the financing right. That we need to kind of finance development objectives appropriately, but that we also need to finance climate adaptation and mitigation appropriately too. And those two objectives should not get in each other's way. You know, we're all grown up. The world can kind of walk and chew gum at the same time. I mean, if we can't kind of both tackle extreme poverty and tackle climate change, then shame on us, frankly. But we need to, there'll be a lot of work between now and the end of the year to make sure that we do that. Climate change, unquestionably, you know, hits the poorest of the world first and worst. It hits dryland farmers worst. In the Sahel, you know, the kind of belt of territory south of the Sahara in Africa, from the Atlantic coast, from Mauritania right through to Somalia, you can see they're a sort of triple threat of extreme climate, extreme poverty, and extreme ideology sort of coming together. This is where Boko Haram is. This is where Al-Shabaab is. These are tough parts of the world where it's extremely difficult to kind of make a living at the best of times, but certainly difficult if climatological and other changes go against you. So the development agenda and the climate agenda need to go together. There's no reason why they can't. There's no reason why we shouldn't all be able to kind of work together. The one thing that I always say is the poorest people of the world deserve a life just like you. They deserve life just like you. You know, when you walk into your home in Boulder in the evening, you know, you're not just kind of looking for one light so that your son can do their homework. You know, you want the fridge, you want the TV, you know, you want all the other things that you've worked hard for, and you've deserved them, but everyone deserves them too. So, I mean, I kind of hate any suggestion that, you know, people who have not had the benefits of the kind of wonderful 50, 60 years of prosperity that we have all had somehow have to wait for it because of some other reason.
Why don't you join me in giving a big round of applause to our speaker, Michael Elliott. Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Nice to be back.